Okay, let's talk a little bit about immigration. Okay, so we are going to focus on economic immigrants, and these are immigrants that have migrated uh, because they are motivated by economic gain. Okay, so legal immigrants in the United States, it's about 1 million per year, and they are admitted through quotas, as refugee status, or by H-1B provision. H-1B provision is an immigration law that allows about 65,000 high-skilled workers to enter and then stay in the United States to work for 6 years. Okay, so this, includes professors and scientists and computer scientists, etc. So people who have usually master's degrees or higher. It accounts for 1/3 of the U.S. population growth and for about half of labor force growth. U.S. law favors family reunification. So a lot of immigrants are admitted because they have a family member that's already in the U.S. That could be a parent, a sibling, a spouse, etc. And so they want the family to stay together. Okay, so we can see here, starting in late 80s, there was a huge spike in legal immigration. This was due to an amnesty program. And then since then, legal immigration has stayed fairly steady, but rising. There was a short downturn here. This was for the recession, since there wasn't as many jobs, not as many immigrants came to the United States. We also have illegal immigrants, and this has been a hot topic in the campaign trail. And it's estimated to be about 250,000 per year on average, mainly from Mexico and Central America. So in 2012, out of the 11.1 million illegal immigrants in the U.S., 58% were from Mexico. Okay. So the total number of immigrants, we get the most from Mexico. Okay. This was for the year 2011. And then China is number 2, and then India, number 3. Okay, so why do people decide to migrate? Usually the first reason is to take advantage of better economic opportunities. A lot of people see the United States as a land of opportunity, land of dreams, and they know that they can get paid more for their work should they come to the United States. Another reason would be for political or religious oppression. So we can see what's happening right now in Syria with the war there, and they have a lot of Syrians migrating, mainly to Europe, but also some are trying to come to the United States. And another reason would be to reunite with family members. Okay, so the driving force for people to migrate is they want to increase their earning opportunities. They have a certain skill set, and this is defined by their human capital, how much skills and knowledge that a person possesses. And so they know that they can get paid more for their human capital in countries such as, for example, the U.S. or Australia or Switzerland than they can back home in, let's say, Mexico. Okay. However, it's not always an easy decision to migrate. What is taken into account are moving costs. These are explicit and implicit. So explicit moving costs would be, application fees. It costs over $1,000 to apply for a green card, or in some cases, someone may pay a coyote, and that's someone to smuggle them across the border. That's a high cost as well. And then also implicit costs, such as leaving family, or when you leave, if an immigrant was working back home, then the salary that they're giving up in order to come to the United States. And what we do find too is distance is a big factor. The longer the distance of where they're migrating to, the higher the cost. So they tend to migrate to countries that are close to them. So people in Eastern European countries tend to go to Western Europe. People in Mexico tend to go to the United States, for example. And a lot of them follow a beaten path. If they know friends and family that have migrated to a certain country and city, they'll go and follow them because they have better information of what to expect and job opportunities. Also, younger workers tend to be the ones who migrate. Their opportunity cost of leaving is lower. Older people might be poor health, and also they usually have higher incomes and closer to retirement. Younger workers have lower income. They have more time to recoup moving costs, and also they have less possessions and they're more likely to be single, so they don't have to move a whole families. Studies have shown that immigrants who don't have good English skills tend to not do as well. For example, in the United States, however, they stay in the United States because they know that their children will have a better economic future. Okay. So immigrants as a percent of the labor force, you can see Australia has a high percentage of their labor force made up of immigrants. New Zealand's right below. The United States is just above 15%. This is in 2007. And then you can see, Greece, Denmark, and Finland are also have immigrants as part of their labor force as well, but not to such a high degree as, for example, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. The fact that the U.S. has so many immigrants coming in shows that the economic benefits of immigrating exceed the costs. However, we do know that not all immigrants do so well, and sometimes they're faced with uncertainty and they came based on imperfect information. They may not find the job that they thought they would. The pay may not be as high as it would, or they just can't really fit into the American way of life. And so sometimes what happens is backflows, and this backflows is when immigrants go back to their home country, and that happens here in the U.S. There is a large black flow as well. Also, they find that they don't earn as much as native-born workers, and this is because they lack skill transferability. Okay, and this is the ability to transfer skills from one sector to another or one place to another, and so their skills don't necessarily transfer, and so therefore they're not considered skilled in America and get paid less for it. And the differences in skill could be because of occupational licensing. A license to, let's say, cut hair in Mexico is not accepted here in the U.S., or it can be the machines that they were operating in Mexico, or the methods they were using to farm, isn't the machines or methods used here in the U.S. as well. And it tends to be a problem, especially for immigrants that don't speak English. However, a lot of migration is characterized by self-selection. Okay, and it's basically that people decide to migrate because they have a higher motivation to make a better life for themselves. They're willing to take risks and make sacrifices now in order to have a better future. And so they tend to learn new skills fast, pick up English fast, and even do better than native-born workers. And this is very true of highly skilled immigrants, so like engineers, scientists, etc. We see that immigrant entrepreneurs found about 35% of U.S. semiconductor companies. 1 in 4 public companies backed by venture capital have been founded by a U.S. immigrant, and so on. They tend to be very entrepreneurial. Okay. However, people want to know, what is the impact on wages, efficiency, and output that comes with immigration? Okay, so we're going to look at a graph and we're going to make a few assumptions to simplify things. So this is a graph that shows immigration to the U.S. from Mexico. We are also assuming labor demand is greater than the U.S. because the U.S. is a more diversified economy. They have better technology, better infrastructure, more capital. Therefore, the productivity per worker is higher. There is no long-term unemployment. Labor quality is the same. Migration is legal and has no cost. And then the main reason why people immigrate is because of wage differentials. Essentially, the wage in the U.S. is higher than Mexico, so that's why they want to come to the U.S. Okay, both these graphs show labor demand. So this is labor demand for the United States, okay, and labor demand from Mexico. And again, we mentioned that labor demand in the U.S. is higher because of better infrastructure, higher amounts of capital, more diverse economy, etc. Okay. Then we have the wage rate, and so we're going to assume each country starts off at point C. Okay, so they demand C quantity of labor at wage M and wage W. Okay, and so workers leave Mexico, go to the U.S. because U.S. has higher wage rates. Okay, and so what we see here is a movement along the demand curve from Mexico. Okay. And then a movement on the demand curve for the U.S. Okay. So at the new point, the U.S. demands a higher quantity of labor, and what we see also is that the wage falls because there's more workers willing to work and accept a lower wage. And here in Mexico, okay, the wage rises. Okay. Because now there's less workers available, and so each worker gets paid more. Okay, so what we see is that U.S. wages fall and Mexico wages rise. Okay, and you can see here that they're more equal now across both countries. Okay. Also, total output rises. So before, output was 0, A, B, C. Okay. And now output is 0, A, D, F. Okay. So total output for the U.S. rises. Now let's look at output for Mexico. Before, output was 0, A, B, C. Okay, and now it's 0, A, D, F. So there's been a drop in output from Mexico. However, the gain in output for the U.S. is greater than the loss in output in Mexico, and so total net output is higher. And also U.S. businesses gain. Okay. So before, with WU, okay, this was their total gain. And now with a lower wage, okay, they were able to capture this additional increase. Okay. So output and efficiency has increased due to immigration. Efficiency has increased because it's the same number of workers, but because they've been redistributed, total net output has increased. Okay, and so just like we discussed, wage rates were equalized. In the U.S., wage rates falls, employment and output rise. And in Mexico, wage rate rises, and employment and output fall. However, the gains in the U.S. exceed the losses in Mexico. Okay. That model we looked at was very simple. However, it's not always so simple. The gains are not always so clear-cut. What we do find is that immigrants send a lot of money back home, and that's what it means here by remittances. So we can see that India alone sends over 60 billion US dollars back home. So that's $60 billion that the workers could have spent in the US economy, but instead they're sending to their family back home, and it benefits the Indian economy. And for Mexico, it's about $24 billion back home. So it equals about 2% of their GDP. And this is why Mexico tends to support very liberal immigration laws from the US. So what we do find is that world output rises and there are efficiency gains. However, there are some negative effects, and one of them being a brain drain. And this is when a country's skilled labor force, or the most educated labor force, leaves in search of higher income opportunities somewhere else. And so this is a concern because a nation's GDP depends on productivity, and skilled labor contributes more to GDP because they're more productive than unskilled labor. Also, U.S. natives in some industries do see their wages drop because immigrants are willing to come in and work for a lower wage. And however, U.S. businesses gain because now it's costing them less to produce a good since they can hire cheaper labor. And so we see that their overall incomes rise. Okay. And so we know that migration costs are not zero, just like the model assumed they were. We saw that migration makes wages equal. Okay, it would stop short to where the wage in the country they're immigrating to is equal to their costs. The wage has to be higher than their migration costs in order for immigrants to be willing to come to another country. Also, remittances do redistribute income, and so the overall, gain from immigrants is not as high as the model would assume either, since a lot of that money is sent back home. And some immigrants do go back home. They go back home and they start businesses there instead of staying in the U.S., for example, and starting businesses in the U.S. Also, immigrant workers, a lot of times are seen as a substitute to native workers, but sometimes they're also complementary. So, for example, a company hires immigrant workers, and since immigrant workers are cheaper, the company's cost drops, and so they're able to produce more output. Higher output leads to an expansion of the business, and so total demand for labor rises. And that's not necessarily a bad thing because the company then demands more labor, whether it's from native-born workers or from immigrant workers. And again, since these businesses are earning more income due to lower labor costs, then they may buy new capital and expand their factories, etc. It could also be a negative thing in the sense of if labor is so cheap, then firms may decide to just stay with cheap, unskilled labor versus investing in research and development and in buying newer, more expensive capital. The other assumption the model had is that the economies were both at full employment. However, a lot of times the economies are not at full employment and there's unemployment going on. And so in this case, Mexico would benefit because their unemployed workers would leave and there would be less social services from the government spent on them. And it's less competition for workers that stay to find a job. But in the United States, if there's already high unemployment going on, then immigrants are viewed as job competition, and then immigrants are looked unfavorably upon. In this case, we could view workers coming to the United States as having negative self-selection. And this is where the workers who decide to migrate in this case have lower skill sets than domestic workers, and so therefore lower wage earning opportunities in their home country, and that's why they come to the U.S. Another concern is that more money will be spent on the immigrant than earnings from the taxes they pay. So we saw that before the 70s that the immigrants receiving any type of government public assistance was very minimal. But then when illegal immigrants began to come to the U.S. after 1970, that the share of immigrants using government public assistance programs increased significantly. Now, there was a change in the U.S. welfare system, and where immigrants couldn't receive any type of public assistance the first 5 years. So that helped minimize, but still to this day, immigrants utilize welfare higher than non-immigrants. Also, research findings are mixed in terms of wages. Wages are not equalized, and then the effect on the American wage isn't always clear. It can be anywhere from -3 to +2%. However, we have found that overall, in the United States, immigration has increased domestic output and income, and that highly educated immigrants add to the economy. They're entrepreneurs, they start new businesses, and they help generate economic growth. When it comes to illegal immigration, there are usually two extreme views. The first view is that there's a fixed number of jobs in the economy, so for every job that an illegal immigrant gets, that's one less job for a domestic worker. The other view is that the work that immigrants do is very undesirable, and it's work that domestic workers don't want anyways, and so there's no workers displaced. Both those views are not necessarily correct. For the first view, there have been industries such as agriculture where the demand for labor has been higher than the supply, and so immigrants have helped fill that demand, that gap, that demand for labor, that native workers weren't taking those jobs anyways. As far as immigrant work being undesirable, that's also not entirely true either. And it's true to the point of the compensating wage differential. If a job that is highly undesirable pays enough, then an American worker or a domestic worker will want it and be willing to work for it. So they may be competing with immigrants for that same job. Okay. So immigration, we can see, has its benefits and its costs. And, immigration from an economic point of view should be allowed until its marginal benefit equals its marginal cost. As always, that's the optimizing condition. And the level of immigration in the U.S. is set through quotas, provisions, immigration laws, and then illegal immigration, is harder to control. It really depends on how well the borders are enforced. Okay, this concludes Chapter 23, Immigration.